Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to the second episode of the International Desk, the official podcast of the King's Geopolitics Forum. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by our guest, the Middle East editor for the Society, Mr. Aurele Tobelem. Would you like to introduce yourself, please?
Yes, of course. Thank you, Ishan, for having me on. My name is Aurele Tobelem, as Ishan so expertly said. I'm the Middle East editor at King's Geopolitics Forum. I'm a final year history student here at King's. I am mainly specializing in colonial North African history, as well as a sort of minor specialization in ideas of law, justice, criminality. So what I generally try and focus on is wider networks of influence and symbiosis, and that's the ethos I take into my work and how I translate it to the events that we've had at KGF and the journal that will be coming out later.
Very excited for the journal as well. Let's begin by taking stock, firstly, of what's going on in the Middle East, and you can maybe touch upon some of the events that we have had in our region in focus this month.
Of course. So, look, the past year and a half in review has been extremely eventful. I think we've had many
to say the least.
Exactly, to say the least. I think we've had many overturns of really tidal changes in the power structures that were governing the Middle East for probably around 20, 30 years at least. And of course, we have the very tragic and horrific events of October 7th that were kind of trigger behind many of these really momentous occasions. But I think the Israel-Gaza war has a lot to do with what we've seen in terms of the decline of the axis of resistance that is led by Iran, backed by Iran, proxies that have been operating with Iranian money, among others, but predominantly with Iranian money for a long time, wreaking havoc. Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis, for example, these are all groups that were sponsored directly by the Iranian regime and continue to be sponsored. But they have all seen deterioration of their military capabilities. I mean, we've seen, first off, Hamas. It was reported, I believe a few months ago, just before the new year, that about 23 out of 24 Hamas battalions had been eliminated by the IDF in Gaza. They were now operating as a guerrilla group. It seems that with the hostage, I don't want to say exchange, because it's not a hostage exchange, it's a hostage deal in which innocent Israeli civilians are being exchanged for murderous Palestinian prisoners, many of them, who have done horrendous terrorist attacks. But we are seeing perhaps a resurgence of Hamas activity in the next few years on account of 1,000 Palestinian prisoners, many of them, unfortunately, not so sweet characters who have been released. But with Hezbollah, we saw the Page operation a couple of months ago. That was really a stroke of genius for the Israeli war effort, especially in its offenses against Lebanon. It crippled Hezbollah militarily. Also, what we've seen with the Page operation is that it actually allowed Israel to make a demographic map, almost, of Lebanon, using the explosions and which hospitals operatives were being taken to, which localities were the most explosive, let's say, to essentially pinpoint strategic locations in which they can strike. And that has essentially forced Lebanon into a ceasefire agreement, which I hope will last, especially now that we have finally a Lebanese president, Joseph Aoun, who is not a Shia extremist. He's a married Christian, I believe. I'm concerned that Nawaf Salam is the Prime Minister of Lebanon now, the former ICJ judge, who just recently in one of his political speeches described Israel as the enemy. So that's going to be quite spicy. Syria, fall of Assad regime.
That was
I mean, that
a development, to say the least.
very much. It was a bit of a Christmas present, let's say, for many in the region. It was a regime that was responsible for hundreds of thousands of deaths and millions of people displaced. Among them, Syrians, Lebanese, Palestinians as well, Israelis. So, look, no one, unless they're stark raving lunatic, no one is sad to see Assad go. The Houthis, they're, I wouldn't say harmless, but right now they simply don't have the capabilities to effectively deal with Israel in any substantial way. Perhaps they can continue to terrorize the GCC. I hope they don't. It wouldn't be in their interests. But right now they seem to be far more loyal to themselves than they are to the IRGC. So that's the sort of, apologies, long overview, but
No, it just tells us how multifaceted this conflict is.
of course.
And the dynamics of the region being so complex. I was interested to ask, what are your contacts on the ground telling you? Is the picture that they provide different from what we're seeing in the media, especially here in the West, with news channels reporting the war in Gaza for since it began? So
Well, of course, because I think it also depends what media you're focusing on. Western media has traditionally been very unreliable on covering wars in the Middle East, and this is probably since the 1980s. And when there were tensions, hostilities that were being exchanged between Israel and Lebanon, Western media was notoriously untrustworthy. And there have even been cases where some Israeli media outlets have not been particularly reliable in this war. Haaretz is a very good case in point during when Hassan Nasrallah was eliminated on the 27th of September, bringing an end to much of the Hezbollah leadership. Haaretz reported 300 casualties when actually Lebanese officials themselves were reporting in the double digits, some less than 10. So I think, not to mention a lot of misinformation floating around in Arab media, especially the Qatari-sponsored Al Jazeera media network. It's been essentially a propaganda outlet for the Qatari regime. It has consistently sponsored Qatari talking points. Rabbi Dr. Ari Berman, for example, who is the president of Yeshiva University, he gave an address at President Trump's inauguration. Just earlier this month. And Al Jazeera, when they were covering the inauguration, the moment the rabbi got up to speak, they switched to an analysis, another channel. Essentially, they did not want to cover his speech nor give it any airtime. So if they're doing that for one Jewish leader in the US, you can imagine what they are doing for the self-described Jewish state. In terms of the actual situation on the ground, it's fraught with many complexities, right? People are not often educated on the relationships between different groups in the region. People are not often educated on Palestinian militancy, for example. PFLP, PIJ, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, Hamas, which in Arabic, for those of you watching who are not sure, stands for Harakat al-Muqawama al-Islamiyya, which means Islamic Resistance Movement. They all have their own little kingdoms. Hamas is an arm, of course, of the Muslim Brotherhood movement. Palestinian Islamic Jihad actually had very, very strong ties with Iran. They had received in 2023 for decades, I believe, $1 billion cumulatively from the Iranian regime. And Hamas had also been sponsored in a similar manner. But people often do not distinguish. They see the goodies, the baddies. That's all they want to see, really. And our job, I think, as policy analysts, is to make sure that we actually don't get too political with the ways in which we are analyzing events. My personal take is that we should see who is the net force for instability in the region and who is the net force for stability. Right? And when you look at it that way, you can very easily decide who your partner should be. who your allies should be, and who is probably best left elsewhere. And the IRGC, for example, as we saw last night with Catherine Paris-Shandan, who spoke so well, is a net force for instability. It is a major disruptor in the Middle East. It always has been. It's a destroyer of worlds. It sponsors terrorism, not only in the Middle East but also elsewhere. And this simply cannot continue. The Western world cannot have allies who are like this. The actual situation on the ground, let's say in Gaza, for example, is difficult. I don't want to give viewers, for example, the impression, Ishan, that there's absolutely no suffering. I think we often tend to elide those realities. People in Gaza are suffering, just as people in Israel were suffering on October 7th, and hostage families that continue to suffer, knowing that their family members are dead or possibly still in the hands of Hamas. There's been a lot of suffering in this war. There, unfortunately, has been a lot of propaganda, falsehood, misinformation that has been spread, especially using X, Instagram, TikTok. These are sort of the three horsemen of real misinformation.
Social media in general has been a big player.
Exactly.
Definitely.
And it's important that we recognize that human beings, at the end of the day, are human beings, right? And they're going to have their own feelings about conflicts. They're going to have their own immediate sentiments, and cultural upbringing, makes a difference. I would expect I don't have the same culture, for example, as a Palestinian from Khan Yunis, correct? Or at least a lot of my family members live in southern Israel, about 20 kilometers from northern Gaza. But the differences are very stark. The differences in upbringing, in education, how people react to conflicts, and the way in which they think about enmity or friendship are very, very different based on who their friends are, based on the education that they've received, based on the cultural narrative that they have been fed. And we are seeing very malevolent actors on the ground, especially UNRWA, taking advantage of this, as they have done for decades, by indoctrinating generations of children across the Levant to grow up to be Israel haters and grow up to believe that there is absolutely no path to peace whatsoever with a state that is not going anywhere, and that has emerged as one of the stronger players in the Middle East.
So speaking of the friends and enemies dimension that you mentioned, let's zoom out and look at the geopolitics of the region. How do you see things playing out between Iran and its proxies in the coming months? How do you think it is going to impact Israel's normalization of its relations with GCC countries? I mean, we were very close to achieving the normalization of relations between Israel and Saudi Arabia, something that people would consider unheard of a few years ago. So what's your take on that?
I think we have to deconstruct these proxies a bit more, and we have to look at the ways in which they operate. Right? These are not groups that operate rationally outside of survival. They're quite, let's say, pathogenic in the way they operate. Right? Hamas, Hezbollah, Houthi ideologies, even though Hamas, for example, is radical Sunni jihadist organization, and Musa Abu Marzouk, who is one of the leaders of Hamas, actually recently reaffirmed that they are essentially the Palestinian arm of the Muslim Brotherhood, radical Sunni jihadist movement. But Hezbollah and Houthi movements are Shia, which is a distinction that often people don't pay attention to. It's something I'm not going to get into detail too much about, but they are religious distinctions that in the Islamic world do matter. However, religious loyalties are often very delicate, and they can be swept aside in favor of popular loyalties. Correct? I mean, the Houthis are focused right now on their survival. I think they're actually moving slightly away from the Iranian regime, at least for now, at least while the Iranian regime is weak. Hezbollah seems to be doing the same thing. They have essentially given way to now a Lebanese political class that is separated from them, to try and take control, mainly because they don't have the capabilities to ensure that essentially their tyranny is or their stronghold
So do you
on
think
Lebanon is
this-
continued, is maintained.
This capability of Hezbollah
Yes.
would be further diminished after what happened in Syria, because now there is no direct land route between Iran and Lebanon.
Well, now, actually, if you're Lebanese and you have no involvement, by involvement I mean familial relation in Syria, it is now almost impossible to get into Syria. Right. Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, led by Ahmed al-Shara, known under his war name as Mohammed al-Jolani, though he prefers politically now to be called Ahmed al-Shara. There are many issues that he has with allowing potential Hezbollah sympathizers from Lebanon into Syria. He is absolutely not prepared to have Hezbollah inflict more damage on Syria than it already has with the help of the Assad regime. So that, as you point out, has effectively cut off the Iranian regime's route through Syria into Jordan, into Saudi Arabia. And I believe it's going to be very difficult now for the regime, now that it's disconnected from its proxies, to really inflict so much damage on the Levant. We could be looking, potentially, if Saudi-Israel normalization is pushed through, we could be looking at the establishment of a Middle East economic corridor that may prove the perfect deterrent to Iranian regime malfeasance. It's very much how do I put this? A better alternative. It's a better alternative. The sweet song of radicalism and Shia Islamism sounds very lovely for people who are suffering from socioeconomic deprivation, as we've seen in Lebanon, with an enormous devaluation of their currency, which paved the way for terrorist groups and mafia running the streets. But now we're looking at a new hope. I'm optimistic. I think as optimistic as you can be,
Given the current circumstances.
given that currently Israel's neighbors are still remain jihadists and dictators, but perhaps they are more strategic right now, and they are thinking slightly more clearly than they may have been 2 years ago.
So talking about post-conflict reconstruction, how do you think that process being executed in the coming months and years?
Well, I mean, President Trump now, we have a renewed Trump administration. He's talked more about the opportunities that Gaza presents. He's talked about it as though it's a real estate haven. It's somewhere where you can settle, you have a resort, you have a
Seaside, amazing.
Exactly. But to be honest, he forgets that Gaza, well, much of Gaza was like this. You know, if you were part of the Hamas political military elites, you had resorts, you had spas, you had great cafes, you had amazing, this idea of an open air prison, where they were taking pictures from 2014 to try and constantly justify the open air prison element of the argument in favor of Hamas and against continued, let's say, Israeli fencing off of the territory, conveniently ignoring the fact that Egypt have done the same thing. And the Hamas did not have a particularly rational play here. I don't think that Sinwar was very much expecting that a year and a half later, not only would he be dead and gone, I don't think he's actually buried, but that Gaza would be destroyed. You know, I really don't think he expected that. I don't think he expected the level of destruction that we've seen infrastructurally in Gaza. And so the reconstruction element that President Trump has pointed out is crucial, that there is a world in which it wouldn't have had to happen. Now, how do we rebuild it? Hamas cannot, under any circumstances, govern Gaza in the future. That is simply no. Okay? No. You cannot have a bloodthirsty, genocidal, jihadist terrorist group that has promised that it would do October 7th again and again and again. You cannot have them running Gaza. And for anyone who's doubting that Hamas have said that they'll do it again and again, Ghazi Hamad, who was one of the senior members of the Hamas Politburo, I believe he's still alive, said this on Arab TV about a month after the events of October 7th. Now, when you have a group that promises to do that they adhere to an ideology that is solely focused on the destruction of Israel at all costs, given the thousands of deaths that they have incurred, that they are squarely responsible for, how can you live next to a group that does such things?
So what's the political solution to this? I mean,
political solution.
We've talked about a military solution to the conflict in Gaza. It has definitely not worked out. It is, I think, clear from a policy perspective that there needs to be a political solution to this political problem. So how do you go about doing that?
I'm concerned that President Trump has essentially been pressuring for the past week Jordan and Egypt to take in more.
Yes, that's that.
I'm concerned that perhaps what he is trying to do is clear the way so that American forces can essentially finish Hamas area. And then he can draw up plans, perhaps with the Emiratis and the Saudis, to reconstruct Gaza a la America. Right? I don't think it's going to be that simple.
Definitely.
Honestly, I really don't think it's going to be that simple. I think that they are going to very quickly realize that unless they have security forces coordinated with the Israelis in Gaza, constantly monitoring what is going on, they are not going to achieve their policy goals. Especially if groups that have proven themselves to be, in the best case, ineffective and impotent, and in the worst case, actively sponsoring malevolence and genocidal violence, the UN, right? United Nations, with especially in the form of UNRWA and its unholy alliances with terrorist organizations. I mean, this is an organization that cannot be allowed to operate. And actually, Israel has taken steps to replace UNRWA, but there must be a lasting solution. If you're asking me personally, what is the political/military solution to Gaza? I don't know. I'm not a member of the Israeli establishment. I don't have the intelligence available to me right now to be able to foresee every single problem that we may encounter in Gaza. What I can say, though, is as long as there isn't a widespread, large-scale de-radicalization program on all of Gaza, every single Gazan civilian, Gazan child, we will continue to see suffering in that region.
That's a fair assessment. Well, I think that nicely wraps up this podcast. You have given us some hope to look forward to with little uncertainty here and there, as is the case with geopolitics.
Always.
And that's why we have the King's Geopolitics Forum, where we like to discuss the geopolitics, the uncertainties, and the glimmers of hope that we can find.
There are many glimmers of hope. This is the issue. Is oftentimes we get put into this rabbit hole
And negative mindset.
exactly where we believe that there's actually no progress that can be made. However, the contingent of individuals who are actively sponsoring instability in the Middle East, as compared to the overwhelming majority of actually fairly decent people who don't want to be bothered, who simply want to be able to put food on their table and send their children to school fully clothed is, the contingent of people who are actively opposing that is quite small. However, they are small but well-financed, well-armed, right? And Israel has to coordinate with its partners, not only in the US but also in the GCC, in order to make sure that we do not have a resurgence of jihadist violence in the region. Jordan and Egypt might be teetering. Jordan seems to be quite strong right now, but it has a very, very significant Palestinian population who, unfortunately, have been radicalized, who, unfortunately, many of whom have received an UNRWA education in which they are indoctrinated to hate Israel. Egypt, now we've seen a resurgence of Muslim Brotherhood activity, right? I mean, we saw protests against Sisi in which people were waving flags traditionally associated with the Muslim Brotherhood. Israel currently is in a precarious position, right? Because we are seeing a return of Sunni political Islam to the Middle East. And the enemy that you know is often easier to deal with than the enemy that you don't know.
That's true.
And it's important for Israel to keep its eye on the ball, because while Hamas militarily may not be able to inflict another October 7th, that doesn't mean that you won't have groups in Egypt or Syria or even Jordan who might try and do the same.
Yeah, that's something to keep an eye out for, as you say, and I'd encourage the audience to follow us on social media, our WhatsApp group chat, so that they can keep track of the future events coming up. We have wrapped up our Middle East month, as I said earlier, and yeah, we look forward to seeing you in future events. We hope that you take good care of yourself, and thank you for being part of this.
Thank you very much, Ishan.